This is just a sample of the audiobook. To get the complete audiobook, access the link posted in the first comment.
Language, politics, and commerce, they've always been intertwined, both for better and for worse. What I presented to that glitterati crowd, and what I proffer to my political and corporate clients every day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, are the precise tools and insights of political and commercial wordsmithing. These tools apply broadly to almost any endeavor that involves presenting a message, whether it's a day-to-day event like talking your way out of a speeding ticket, or something more substantial like crafting a 15-minute speech to your employees, or even writing an hour-long State of the Union address. In this audiobook, my basic advice to listeners will be, it's not what you say, it's what people hear. You can have the best message in the world, but the person on the receiving end will always understand it through the prism of his or her own emotions, preconceptions, prejudices, and pre-existing beliefs. It's not enough to be correct, or reasonable, or even brilliant. The key to successful communication is to take the imaginative leap of stuffing yourself right into your listener's shoes to know what they are thinking and feeling in the deepest recesses of their minds and hearts. How that person perceives what you say is even more real, at least in a practical sense, than how you perceive yourself. When someone asks me to illustrate the concept of words that work, I tell them to read Orwell's 1984 and then see the movie. In particular, I refer them to the book passage that describes Room 101, or as Orwell describes it, the place where everyone's personal, individual nightmares come true. If your greatest fear is snakes, then you open the door to a room full of snakes. If your fear is drowning, your room 101 is filled to the brim with water. To me, this is the most frightening, horrific, imaginative concept ever put on paper, simply because it encourages you to imagine your own room 101. But the movie version of 1984 denies the viewer the most powerful aspect that makes room 101 work, one's own imagination. Once you actually see room 101, it is no longer your vision. It becomes someone else's. Lose imagination, and you lose an essential component of words that work. Just as a fictional work's meaning may transcend authorial intention, so every message you bring into the world is subject to the interpretations and the emotions of the people who receive it. Once those words leave your lips, they no longer belong to you. The act of speaking is not a conquest, but a surrender. When we open our mouths, we are sharing with the world, and the world inevitably interprets, indeed sometimes shifts and distorts, our original meaning. After all, who hasn't uttered the words, but that's not what I actually meant? Just ask former President Jimmy Carter. On July 15, 1979, 3 years to the day from his triumphant nomination at the Democratic National Convention, he addressed millions of Americans to explain what he called America's crisis of confidence. That phrase means nothing to most Americans. We all know it as his infamous malaise speech, despite the fact that he never uttered the word malaise even once. Or just ask former Secretary of State Colin Powell, as I did, about the origin of the so-called Powell Doctrine of military success. When it was first articulated in 1991, his exact words referenced a strategy of decisive force. But in the hands of the reporters and even the historians, it has ended up translated as overwhelming force, and is now often called the Powell Doctrine of overwhelming force. To the average reader, this may appear to be a difference without a distinction. For Powell, the distinction still matters a lot. To him, decisive meant, and I quote, precise, clean, and surgical, unquote, whereas overwhelming implies excessive and numerical. The former is smart and sophisticated, the latter heavy-handed and brutish. So how did this happen? The answer is more in the translation than the message itself. Powell did use the phrase overwhelming force publicly, but just one time, in 1990, and he used it to describe the force necessary to ensure that America, quote, wins decisively, unquote, every war it engages. In almost every other instance, Powell reiterates his desire for decisive force because it ends wars quickly and in the long run saves lives. Ultimately, it is the professional, the journalists, historians, and academics who translates words into stories. They're the ones that hold the key to language dissemination. They have to grab people's attention, and overwhelming force just sounds more captivating than decisive force. It creates an image in the mind that goes far beyond the dull, policy-based decisive force terminology. Overwhelming force is about process. Decisive force is about result. Yet no matter how hard Powell has tried to correct and clarify the public record, The world will always think otherwise, and the consequences of that misinterpretation can be seen in Iraq every single day. Ask for